Hello, my name is Andrej and you're watching the Serbian History Games channel. This will be a fourth episode on World War II in Yugoslavia, a war which had more factions than Westeros has noble houses. Indeed, someone has counted more than 20 different factions operating in Yugoslavia during the war, and I'm going to give you an overview of the main ones, as well as the overview of the operational geography. Now, first of all, the German army. The German army left only about 4 second-class divisions in the German zone, which comprised approximately 2/3 of the country, of the north of the country. 3 of those 4 divisions were located in Serbia, which is quite excessive for Western European standards, but which would in fact prove insufficient for Serbia. They were later reinforced by 1 or 2 first-rate divisions, and occasionally more. One of those first-rate divisions being recruited locally from the local Volksdeutsche. However, this was the Prince Eugen SS Mountain Division, and the Volksdeutsche lived in the lowlands in Pannonia, so go figure. In any case, how did the Germans plan to keep the country with only so few forces? Well, with the help of some good old-fashioned brutality. Now, they instituted a reprisal policy of 100 Serbs killed for every German killed and 50 Serbs killed for every German wounded. Simple math says that for each German 100-man company, 10,000 Serbian lives would be lost. If not enough adults could be found, then school children would do. A similar policy was instituted in Greece and actually nowhere else in Europe. However, it should be noted that, aside from persecution of the Jews, this German brutality was reactive. If the guerrillas did not attack the Germans, then, not tens of thousands of Serbs would not be killed in retaliation. Then we come to the much less murderous occupiers, the Italians. I believe the Italians had 10 or more divisions in Yugoslavia, and actually they were much less cruel than the Germans. Of course, they did not like the Croats due to their designs on Dalmatia, but if you're a Jew or you're a Serb, then, obviously the Italian zone would be a safe haven. Obviously, not too many great things can be said on Italian martial prowess, but it should be noted that they managed to keep the territories they wanted to keep. So there's that. Then we come to Bulgarians, which I guess come somewhere in between Germans and Italians, but probably closer to Germans. And they were quite numerous. I believe they had several divisions or probably a couple of occupying corps in Serbia, and they're not fondly remembered by the people of eastern and central Serbia. Also, there are the Hungarians. They occupied a very northern part of the country. Comparatively, they were less brutal than the others, but of course, if they occupied a part of England or the US, they would be remembered, with horror. Also, a very honorable mention should be given to Romanians, our great neighbors, because they were a part of Axis, but they actually declined to occupy a part of Yugoslavia, so shout out for Romanians. Then we move on to local collaborators. These would fall into 2 very broad categories, the actual fascists and the home guards. The actual fascists were not very common. A prime example of these would be the Croatian Ustaše, which were complete crazies by any standard, and they did achieve a relative popularity in Croatia due to the creation of Greater Croatia. These were quite adept at massacring Serbs, Jews, Roma, but were not very good in an actual stand-up fight. Actually, the forces of Axis Croatia were thrashed by the Serbian rebels a number of times, despite them being completely outnumbered. There were some better local collaborator fascist units, such as the Ustaše regulars or the Serbian Volunteer Corps. However, the main solution was the creation of German and SS divisions of legionnaire formations from Croatian and Bosniak personnel mixed up with the German officers and personnel. So, harkening back to the good old times of Austria-Hungary. Then we come to the home guards, which were actually the most important part of the local collaborators. These people basically no better than a militia, and they were there just to get by. They were even prone to desert to the rebels. Here we come to the 2 resistance factions. Actually, none of them are the lily white rebels from Star Wars universe, but they did fight the Axis, so I'm going to attach the noble rebel trademark to them, while just without the short-lived alliance. First and foremost, the Chetniks. Now the Chetniks are actually the reorganized Yugoslav army, led by Serb and some Slovene officers. They are now known as the evil Serb Chetniks, simply because the Croats and the Bosniaks joined the Axis, so the Chetniks could only recruit Serbs, and obviously the Ustaše were killing Serbs, so the Chetniks tried to protect the Serbs. And they did retaliate in some cases. Because Serbs were being massacred, the Chetniks started fighting from day one. This was actually not the idea. Colonel Mihailovic wanted to hold off the massive revolt until the Allied help was at hand. Just looking at the map of Europe at that point, one can easily deduce that launching a massive revolt in Serbia or in Yugoslavia would be suicidal. The Germans could find help and crush the revolt in very short order and wreak brutal vengeance. However, the Ustaše massacres meant that the Serb revolt must begin at once. Mihailovic was based in Serbia, so he immediately sent help to his endangered compatriots in Axis Croatia. Obviously, attacking the Germans at this point would make no sense, and attacking the Italians, which were in fact curbing the Ustaše, would be dumb in the extreme. In come the communist partisans. They only became active after the USSR was invaded, and their activity is quite suspect before that date. Now, the Communist Party was illegal in Yugoslavia. The Communist Party was indeed quite ill-disposed towards Serbs, but as a matter of fact, most of the communist partisans were Serbs. They were led by a Croat Tito, who is frankly hyped up to an unimaginable degree. People forget not only his crimes, but the fact that although he received copious amounts of support, material, propaganda, operational support, air cover by the Western Allies, he still did not manage to kick out the Germans from Belgrade without the help of Soviet tanks. Tito supposedly led the largest and best organized guerrilla force of the war, yet they were called bandits by the Germans. The communist partisans would indeed become a respectable force sometime later in the war, but with British help. The partisan groups were led by Spanish war veterans. They did have war experience, but actually very few Yugoslav officers joined the partisans. The communist history claimed that the communists led the Serb and Yugoslav peasants into a revolt against the Axis, with the Chetniks playing second fiddle. But this is tantamount to saying that Antifa groups led the Texans in a mass revolt. It simply does not make any sense. As a matter of fact, the popularity of partisans never matched the popularity of Chetniks, at least until 1943. Actually, the reverses of partisans against the Chetniks at the beginning of the war can be ascribed to sheer lack of popularity rather than some Chetnik huge prowess in fighting a civil war. There is no reason to assume that the partisans were more popular than the Chetniks, but they did try to foment a revolt as soon as possible in order to help the USSR. When the revolt inevitably failed, they would blame the Chetniks. The partisans, however, refused to concentrate their forces fighting the Ustaše and instead wanted to spread the chaos of war into Serbia. The actual primary opponent of the communists was the evil Serb-dominated Yugoslav government. Indeed, the communists did time together with Ustaše in Yugoslav jails. Now, so much for the brutality of the Yugoslav government, which it did not even bother to shoot future war criminals. At the moment when the partisans put red stars on their caps, this meant civil war. Obviously, if they wanted to fight the Axis, they could have, joined the Chetniks or did something else. When they formed their own military units, this could only mean one thing: civil war. The Chetniks and the partisans, aside from the fact that they both did some anti-Axis actions and that their rank and file were mostly Serbs, were actually quite different. The motivating factor for the Chetniks was a nationalist and a patriotic ideology. This is actually quite similar to the partisan rank and file, but their leadership was Stalinist in the extreme. They did not care how many people died so long as communism was furthered. The Chetniks were mostly men of military age, while the partisans tended to prefer to recruit younger people, which could be more easily indoctrinated. In event, they even employed children bombers. The Chetniks are accused of ethnic crimes and chauvinism and painted into some kind of Serbian Ustaše. This is widely disingenuous. They did commit some crimes, that is a fact, and which were primarily motivated by revenge. The communists did not need any provocation to commit their crimes. It was a matter of party policy to shoot undesirables. In fact, Red Terror was an integral part of the communist fight, so much so that it contributed to their lack of popularity compared to the Chetniks, and actually to their reverses against the Chetniks, rather than to some, Chetnik special prowess in fighting the partisans. This difference is nicely reflected in the personalities of their leaders. Colonel Mihailovic was obviously an army officer, specialized for intelligence and guerrilla activities. He organized a remarkably successful underground structure and remarkably widespread underground structure through almost the whole of Yugoslavia, and tried to preserve Serbian lives while at the same time trying to take meaningful action against the Axis. Tito, on the other hand, although he is known as this big anti-fascist fighter, Tito was all about acquisition of power. He rose through the communist ranks by backstabbing and used the opportunity of the war in Yugoslavia to make a communist power grab in Yugoslavia. He is made into this great anti-fascist hero of the resistance, but actually after all of these years looking into the subject, it seems that fighting the Axis was the farthest thing from his mind. The Axis, the Germans, would leave, the Chetniks would stay. So it was most important to defeat the Chetniks rather than to, lose time in fighting the Germans. In fact, it seems that he consistently tried to avoid the Germans and to target his main enemy, the Chetniks. Neither have I seen any evidence of his military genius, devotion to communism, or to a better society. Tito is all about himself. Bottom line. It seems that Stalin recognized this and wanted to remove Tito and replace him with a person that I think would be actually far more capable. A man called Mustafa Golubic. Mustafa was actually a former Chetnik, later became a communist and a general of the NKVD. He is very highly positioned in the Soviet structure, and also he had links to various Yugoslav and Serb officers. So it seems that he would be a far better pick to lead a military resistance. However, Tito's men tipped him off to the Gestapo, and Gestapo shot him, I think, somewhere in July 1941. So the Axis and the resistance sides were not homogeneous. Far from it. The Croats did not like the Italians, and the Italians returned the favor. The Italians wanted to take as much of Yugoslavia as they could, which was horrifying to the German Austrian officers to see that, Italians are encroaching on former Austro-Hungarian territory. The partisans, despite having Serbian rank and file, targeted Serb Chetniks. Mihailovic and Tito had to contend with local commanders, some of which were not keen to get along. This was partially due to the geography of Yugoslavia, which is separated by mountains and rivers. And now I think it's best to give you an overview of the strategic geography, just so you know where things happen. The country probably had around 17 million people in 1941, perhaps 8 million of those Serbs, about 4 million Croats, 1.5 million Slovenes, and probably less than 1 million Bosniaks. Now, Yugoslavia as a whole is divided into the North Pannonic Plain and the South Dinaric Mountains. The North Plain is completely unsuitable for guerrilla operations, so it will be omitted. The southern part is very suitable for guerrilla operations, but is further subdivided by mountains and rivers, and also ethnic composition. There are two outlying regions, Macedonia and Slovenia, and there are the core regions, meaning Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, Herzegovina, Krajina, and Dalmatia. Macedonia can be crossed out almost immediately, as its population tended to be pro-Bulgarian, and obviously no revolt against Bulgarian occupation was forthcoming, at least until 1944. Slovenia, on the other hand, was much more against Axis. Its population was divided among the collaborators, the pro-communist part and the pro-Yugoslav, pro-royal part, with the collaborators being relatively most common, followed by the pro-communist part. The Slovenes gave comparatively to a Western European nation, gave a very good account of themselves during the war in terms of anti-Axis operations. But Slovenia, as a theater of operations, was relatively isolated, so will not be mentioned here very often. Serbia is the most important of these regions. Of course, it's the seat of government, and also it's a very important communications hub. It links Central Europe with Greece and Bulgaria. It has a number of important mines and has a very rebellious population, so it's no wonder that the communists wanted initially to start their revolt there. However, the peasant population of Serbia preferred their king, their church, and their officers. Southwest from Serbia, we move on to Montenegro, which is very important for two reasons. Although it's quite small and not very populated, its population is very warlike and provided very, very good recruits for the resistance forces. And also, the north of Montenegro is a very important land invasion route from Serbia to Bosnia and vice versa. The population of Montenegro was divided, I think probably almost equally, between partisans, Chetniks, and the local independence party, the Greens, which tended to be pro-Italian. Then, after Montenegro, as we go west, we go to Bosnia and Dalmatia. These regions were ethnically quite intermixed, with some Serbs, some Bosniaks, some Croats. Obviously, the Croats and the Bosniaks tended to prefer the Axis. Now, the notable exception are the Dalmatian Croats, which tended to join the resistance, particularly the partisans, probably on account of the fact that Dalmatia was controlled by Italy rather than Axis Croatia. Now, the Serbs in the region of Bosnia and Dalmatia tended to be divided between Chetniks and partisans, with the Chetniks probably having an edge. And finally, we come to the region of Krajina, which is a region of the old Austrian military frontier. It's populated by Serbs and Croats. Croats obviously going for the independent state of Croatia, and Serbs tending to be dominated by the Communist Party. And this is practically the only region where the communists had a clear advantage in popular support. There were no major industries in Bosnia and Krajina, so this would be the region where the partisan activity would be the highest, because obviously the concentration of occupying forces would be the lowest. There you have it. These are the main factions and the operational geography of Yugoslavia. In my next episode, I will be talking about the first year of the war. Please like, share, and subscribe. Until next time.